simple computer program for us to run and test out just to make sure everything was working. And all it did was it printed out hello world on the screen. So if you go ahead and build and run this, we see that it just says hello world and some other computer stuff that isn't really relevant. But anyways, all this computer program does is print out hello world. And before I get into breaking this apart and telling you what each piece does, I want to say one thing. You would think, since computer programs are just made up of a bunch of lines of text, that we can learn each line one at a time. But computer programs are weird in that this is pretty much the most simple program you can write. And check it out. There are already 7 different lines included here. So in order to even write a most basic program, you need to code at least 7 lines of code. So it seems kind of confusing, and I just want to give you guys a warning. As long as you can get through this video, all the rest of the videos are going to be incredibly easy. This is the only one where I have to throw a bunch of information at you, but still, I'm going to break it down as easy as possible. And the reason for that is because you need so many things in order to run such a simple program, but once you understand the basics, everything else is just smooth sailing, I promise. So let me go ahead, and we're going to be getting more in depth in each of these lines, but for now, let me just give you guys a brief introduction to what each line does. Let's go ahead and start at the top and work our way down. This include IOStream line right here, this is technically called a preprocessor directive. So if you're taking a test, if you're watching these tutorials because, maybe you're in C++ class and your teacher's kind of confusing you, answer on the test, this is a preprocessor directive. Now what that means in everyday terms is it pretty much says, alright, we're going to be including a file in this program that we're going to be using later on. So it's going to be including a file, IOStream, that we didn't make. We didn't make this file, but it needs it to run this program later on. So that's why it needed to include it. Again, we're going to be talking more about header files later on, but for the basics of this tutorial, all you need is to know that this line includes a file that our program needs to use later on. Now, the next line you can see is just a blank line. And you may say, alright, do you need this blank line? Do you not need it? Blank lines and spaces, you can have a million of them if you want, or you can have none of them, just like that. All blank lines do in programming is they make the program easier to read. Just with a book or a magazine or a newspaper, sometimes you want blank lines between your code. Sometimes you just want your code right under each other. It's personal preference. People, whatever you want. Blank lines just make it easier to read, so whatever is easier for you, add as many lines or as less lines as you want. And that brings me to another point. These tabs too, see this is kind of tabbed out or tabbed in. It's the same thing. Some people tab things in, make it easier to read. This program is just going to run just fine if it's just like that. But, people just like to line certain things up. So you'll see later on once we get coding that tabs and spaces and blank lines, they don't really mean anything significant. They just make the program easier to read. So that being said, under that blank line is this using namespace STD. And believe it or not, this does not stand for sexually transmitted disease. I like to think that, but trust me, it doesn't. It stands for the standard library, and that's another thing that is built in to C++ that is pretty much saying this. We're going to be using all the standard things with C++, nothing fancy. Again, we're going to be going over libraries and stuff in the future, but basically these two lines include things that we're going to need later on. This includes a file, and this includes something called a library, which, is just a bunch of C++ stuff. So with that being said, we know